Hello, guys and gals, me Mutahar, and I've talked a lot about the old Epstein stuff over here, ladies and gentlemen, but I always promise one thing when I make these videos, is that there is something huge that breaks in here, and something that will always blow your mind. Now, of course, last time we talked about this, the FBI apparently had their servers hacked, which contained a lot of those files that I don't know if somebody has access to anymore, whatever. But today we're going to be talking about something that actually should blow your mind. Literally as of yesterday, as I'm talking about it, the story is breaking even more and more and more. That it seems like the government has actually really jumped in and just completely stonewalled any real, tangible criminal investigation. So for anybody that doesn't know, this was a guy called Leon Black. He's a billionaire financier, and he was supposed to be deposed with the Epstein lawsuits, right? Specifically against the Bank of America, which a lot of the victims say helped process around $170 million without really even questioning what the money was used for. It turns out that money was, I guess, allegedly used for doing really nefarious, terrible things. So he's supposed to be deposed, but guess what, ladies and gentlemen? He wasn't deposed. Basically, the day is not going to arrive. The lawsuit actually settled in this situation. And guess what? This guy that everyone had their eyes on, he gets to walk away pretty much without ever going under oath. Crazy shit. So anyways, I feel like it's time to actually look a little deeper into what has happened. So this is the United States Senate Committee on Finance, all right, March 16th, 2026. They basically said, hey, listen, we found out that apparently they have a settlement with the Bank of America, the actual victims versus the bank. And basically, he says over here that Bank of America's decision to settle with the group of survivors is actually a step towards justice, and a vindication of his staff's investigation into how major Wall Street banks enabled the Epstein crimes. All along the way, attorneys representing the survivors used the findings of my investigation to prove that Bank of America willfully looked the other way as the billionaire Leon Black paid Epstein more than $170 million. So Bank of America's employees repeatedly failed to conduct due diligence and report suspicious transactions to the United States Treasury Department, as required under the Bank Secrecy Act. So again, to give you an idea, what has actually happened to is even companies like Apollo, who are basically the global management firm tied to Leon Black, basically the only thing they've pretty much said is February 18, 2026, they were like, listen guys, the facts matter. From an Apollo perspective, there's nothing new in these Epstein files. Neither Mark Rowan nor anyone else at Apollo, except for Leon Black, had a business or personal relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. So again, big company over here throwing Leon Black basically under the bus. And again, they say Mr. Black retained and compensated Epstein for personal tax advice, right? So again, a lot of it is just wishy-washy speak. But in reality, a lot of people kind of put their finger at him and say, maybe this guy is the financial fixer, right? See, in order to stop crime, in a lot of ways, you have to follow the money. Some of the biggest investigations I've ever done, some of the ones that I'm personally very proud of, a lot of it came down to following the money. If you can follow the money, if you can trace down how it was used, you can basically understand and kind of figure out if there was a criminal element. In some cases, it actually does seem to be that way. Now, basically what the senator over here is effectively saying is under the Bank Secrecy Act, Bank of America processed these huge wire transfers from Leon Black to Epstein, often in $10 to $20 million installments, without asking questions. Now in Canada, there's something similar. It's kind of called FinTrack, which is an organization, but basically they kind of do the whole Bank Secrecy Act in Canada. So to give you an understanding, just from a Canadian perspective, basically, if you have transactions of like $10,000 or more, for instance, then that has to be reported specifically. And here's the fun part. Even if a transaction is like $100, $1,000, you can file what is an STR in Canada or an SAR in America. And those, transaction reports, the suspicious transaction report, basically is filed if, for instance, that, if you think that you're giving money to or you're getting money specifically from somebody that might be in a drug cartel, a fucking terror operation, or if somebody is giving you money that doesn't seem completely kosher, right? At that point in time, you have to file fucking reports. It's funny that when it comes to money and taxes, You know, the government always clamps down on the small guys and even the personal tax person, right? Like, if you file your taxes wrong, the government calls you up maybe years down the road and fucking, you know, they ask you a million questions and, you know, you probably either capitulate or you think maybe you can fight. It's crazy when you look at this Epstein story that 10 to 20 million dollar installments were basically fucking processed by an entire bank and not a fucking question was asked, okay? That is the scary part, but it gets even deeper, so let's go. So because this lawsuit effectively got settled with the Bank of America, the scumbag Leon Black in this case, well, he just gets to go on without ever actually going under oath, which obviously is a pretty big blow when it comes to investigating, because I think the right track was to look into these banks, look at how the money was moving around, and how things were being, sort of handled. Now again, an attorney for the victim basically calls Leon Black a critical witness, and I do tend to agree, because in the lawsuit, they said the Bank of America turned that blind eye to suspicious transfers, again, when it came to $170 million for tax and real estate planning advice, which, again, $170 million is insane. So in a previous settlement agreement between Black and the U.S. Virgin Islands, they said Epstein used the money Black paid him to partially fund his operations in the Virgin Islands. So it's interesting how he was about to be deposed, and then basically a week before, this whole thing gets settled out. I mean, I don't see justice being done over here. I see that if you're rich enough, you can write a fucking check and hand it over and get away, which, I'm not naive. I know that's how the world unfortunately works. I just didn't expect it to be so painfully transparent is sort of the thing. And a guy like Leon Black is somebody Epstein had 862 emails with, a very fruitful and long-running relationship. This was the guy that connected him basically to the finance world that allowed Epstein to commit a vast amount of crimes. Remember, money buys influence. Influence, unfortunately, pays for a shit ton of protection. And a lot of that protection, unfortunately, came in the view of all of these people right here, some of the most powerful financial, political leaders in the world. And this guy was an ultimate connector of all these people, okay? This was a guy that was very good at connecting people together. Unfortunately, it seems like his connection to banks allowed him to commit so many extra crimes, or just basically allow him to get away with his shit as long as he did. Now, in this entire story, too, what you have to also understand is before the settlement, obviously they were wanting to dismiss the case, but there were other banks involved, two other banks specifically, JPMorgan Chase, which paid $290 million to the survivors, and Deutsche Bank, which paid $75 million. So when you read into this lawsuit, obviously, it was brought on behalf of a woman identified in court papers as a Jane Doe, and, it said that the woman was living in Russia when she met Epstein in 2011, and was coerced into a cult-like life. So obviously, isolation from family, and obviously you have a system of, somebody who watches over you, and then you watch over somebody, so it's very much people intertwined with themselves, isolated from the outside, and I guess that's the best way that I can sort of convey what a cult-like life is. Anyways, it said she was paid by Epstein through a Bank of America account as she was controlled financially, emotionally, and psychologically by Epstein from 2011 through 2019 as he abused her for at least 100 occasions. So again, the lawsuit alleges that Epstein paid her rent and income through a phony job through a Bank of America account and held her immigration status over her head until her ultimate escape when Jeffrey Epstein died. So this is how you have your hold over people, right? Like you hold their right to live in a certain part of the world, and you basically control their aspect through the money. And so a bank, this is why we have things like financial auditing. This is why we have things like the Bank Secrecy Act, so that if you do detect somebody is doing something improper with money, whether it's $1,000 or $100,000 or $1 million, you can at least verify that every transaction was made with good faith, it was made legally, and if there is some errant, wrong behavior happening, you can stop it. Banks not doing this is, in my opinion, being complicit to a criminal operation, right? You, if you're a bank and you've taken that responsibility and you're processing everyone's money, you need to make sure your money is being processed properly. And there is nothing untoward's happening. That's the whole point for these banks, right? That's why operations like money laundering exist. It's the ability to take, illegal money and legally put it into a bank that can be used in very legitimate purchases of, assets, right? if banks aren't meeting their end, in my opinion, they're also just complicit. Now, when you look at JP Morgan, for instance, right? JP Morgan had a much tougher time compared to the Bank of America because, at least in JP Morgan, there was some level of evidence that proved that at the top, they weren't really putting any effort into basically making sure that Epstein wasn't spending his money wrong, that the Epstein transactions, rather, weren't done wrong. Honestly, there could be a whole set of Epstein files just related to these banks that would tell more than whatever the government gave us. If you can follow the money, you can figure out who was exactly co-conspirator, who was actually, involved really heavily into this. So Jess Staley was a person that was basically Epstein's biggest connection at JP Morgan. And he was basically a person that was pretty invaluable to Epstein when it came to, again, just how the money worked and how the influence was traded around and basically legitimizing Epstein and his money and his wealth in front of the entire world, right? And it was basically looking into this guy, and when the dam finally burst, right? What JP Morgan had done was going to something called Project Jeep, which is where they went back in, their history with Epstein. They looked through every single transaction, and at this point they flagged 4,700 Epstein transactions they never did before, totaling to the tune of more than $1.1 billion. Hundreds of millions of dollars in payments to Russian banks, and young Eastern European women who were brought to the United States, according to investigators working for Senator Ron Wyden, who was actually digging into this. He was the one that was really digging into the money. Banks are required to file reports in real time to alert law enforcement to things like money laundering, sex trafficking, and drug dealing. Doing it after the fact might have provided JP Morgan with legal cover, but it did nothing to help identify Epstein's crimes as they were happening. I don't think you should be allowed to go back and file that many transaction reports and say that, oh, we finally did our job. No, you should have done your job as it fucking happened. And the thing is, when you look at how bad the situation is and you think about, okay, what was the actual punishment? The punishment was really nothing. They had to pay $290 million to settle a lawsuit. It's interesting because if you do something this criminal and negligent, you actually do face jail time. When a bank or somebody rich does this, they write a check, they get away with it. It's crazy to think we live in the same world that back in 2012, right? The US government, for instance, went after HSBC Bank, a bank, I believe in the United Kingdom. And in HSBC, they were actually, unfortunately, involved with money laundering for Mexican drug cartels. So, for instance, back in 2012, right, the HSBC Bank was exposed by the US government, was basically laundering Mexican drug money. They were failing to actually, do their documentation, failing to actually identify that the guy walking in with hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars was actually fucking involved with a Mexican drug cartel. And when all was said and done and all that money was transacted, all that blood was spilled, all HSBC had to do was pay $1.9 billion in penalties. And you might be like, that might have killed HSBC, Muda. No, you can look at it literally back in 2012. They dropped a little bit, maybe a little bit, and now they're back up better than they ever were before. So, no, none of these banks ever go through with it. And arguably, they are probably the most responsible when it comes to letting these scumbags like Epstein get away with the crimes that they got away with for so long. So I wanted to look even further into the story because, I couldn't imagine that this was that this wasn't being chased for. So obviously something that, again, Wyden brought in, right? The only person really, it seems, going and pushing for this stuff too, said that their investigation does actually continue. So as of March 16th, he's like, my investigation into the Bank of America and other Wall Street banks, how they enabled this, is actually continuing. And he also wants to point out how attorney Pam Bondi and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent have failed to hold these banks accountable. While it's a victory of survivors who actually were compensated for their suffering, the federal government must still act to hold these scumbags accountable. And let me tell you how bad things actually really are here, okay? Just so that, I don't make these videos for you to just be outraged at. I make these videos because ultimately the end, I think a lot of people look at a headline and they don't actually look deeper into the story. Here's where it gets fucked up. So, unfortunately, as of February 26, 2026, This is something that, Senator Wyden brought in. He requested a complete unredacted copy of the document that revealed the existence of the investigation. So this 69-page memorandum. Of course, obviously for us, it's about as redacted as one can expect. All this black everywhere that you can see. So right here is a good quote, the one in bold here. The fact that Epstein was under investigation by this organization was that there was ample evidence indicating that Epstein was engaged in heavy drug trafficking and prostitution as part of a cross-border criminal conspiracy. This is incredibly disturbing and raises serious questions as to how this investigation by the DEA was handled. Since Epstein and his 14 co-conspirators, remember the people that were blacked out by the government, we don't know what they look like. We barely really know their names. Yeah, these guys were never charged by the DOJ for drug trafficking or financial crimes. I am concerned that the DEA and DOJ during the first Trump administration moved to terminate this investigation in order to protect pedophiles. I am also concerned that the excessive redactions for this memorandum for Operation Chain Reaction go well beyond the intent of the EFTA, which allows for redactions to protect the identity of victims, not members of criminal trafficking organizations. So again, it also gets even worse too. So again, there were other details that were concerned. It has come to my attention that you are preventing the DEA from producing an unredacted copy of a report I requested regarding drug trafficking and money laundering by Jeffrey Epstein and several associates. So Wyden writes, your alleged interference in this matter is highly disturbing. Not just because it continues the DOJ's long-running obstruction of my investigation, and this man has been doing this for years, by the way, I think 4 years, but also because of your bizarrely favorable treatment of Ghislaine Maxwell, one of Epstein's closest criminal associates. I should not have to explain the significance of the fact that Epstein was a target of the OCD ETF. It suggests the government had ample evidence indicating that he actually engaged in this drug trafficking and prostitution, and he was likely pumping his victims, including underage girls, with incapacitating drugs. And now what's insane is that Wyden said that he got this confidential tip, basically received from his staff, that the Deputy Attorney General right now, Todd Blanche, who's, the former personal attorney of the President of the U.S., blocked the DEA from complying with Wyden's request. Remember, the DEA was about to jump in and actually just, do what they had to do. They're actually about to follow through with enforcing the law, or actually, enforcing with the investigation. And apparently they were told that, I guess we can't do anything, boss. Ask the guy above. It's also interesting, too, that, again, this goes beyond just one administration. So, for instance, right here, when they were talking about the Treasury Department and they wanted the bank records they had on Epstein, the Biden Treasury Department wouldn't even give the files, but they allowed Finance Committee investigators to review them in person and take notes. That's how I am aware that there is a massive file of Epstein records at the Treasury Department. There are detailed bank records, a roadmap. In fact, there are filings made by banks specifically to alert federal law enforcement to suspicious payments. He even says that Scott Bessent is hiding these Epstein bank records from Senate investigators. He refused repeatedly to turn them over and has refused to let us see what we already know is there. So again, this administration came in with a whole lot of bluster about releasing these files, and it's kind of interesting, right? Like, we've got the files, but actually what I think are important are the financial files that we don't have access to. Unfortunately, in this situation, ladies and gentlemen, the story goes beyond deeper than just a headline. I looked into the settlement. I was really, really looking forward to maybe there was a deposition done. But now, what's insane to me is the one thing that can prove who is a co-conspirator, like the entire money trail, which honestly I don't even think should really be something that only politicians get to see. I think this should be out there with the actual File Transparency Act. It seems like the current administration is putting in so much effort to prevent these files from actually releasing that it makes you wonder just how many people in the current government are actually just, either they're predators or you're somebody that is protecting a child predator, right? Which, to be honest with you, I think if you're protecting the child predator, you're as bad as the actual predator. Because there has to be some level of humanity that kicks in that tells you, maybe, just maybe I should stand up for what's right and give up some of this information. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, this was a huge story that sort of popped up. And unfortunately, the problem with it is that I don't think many people really understand how deep it goes. You know, we have a war kicking in right now. We have a whole bunch of other stuff happening that I think has resulted because of how damaging these files and these connections actually are. Remember, you know, the average normie is talking about these Epstein files now. It's not just somebody on the internet like me talking about it. People are interested in seeing just how complicit their government is when it comes to assisting criminals or letting some of the worst stuff happen. You know, people always say like, Muda, why not go down like a different rabbit hole? The thing is, no other rabbit hole that I can see that I've ever covered in my history, whether it be on the dark web, whether it be like, you know, people hosting Club Penguin servers, whether it be people, you know, doing crazy shit over on TikTok, none of that stuff seems to hit the same as something that is happening in plain sight in front of you that is actually protected by the largest the largest country in the world, the most powerful government in the world, and it seems like they're actively protecting what is basically a big, massive human trafficking network, right? And you know, maybe the guy at the top is dead, but the co-conspirators are not. They still have their money, they still have their influence, they still have their power, and they still have their ability to victimize the victims in this entire story. And I think that's really the thing that hits me the hardest in this, right? It's one of the reasons why I have so much interest. I believe in justice. I believe that justice should be dealt. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like justice is going to be dealt, at least for now, at least for the foreseeable fucking future. But ladies and gentlemen, this is an interesting rabbit hole to go down. The banks definitely, the banks in this case that are all settling out definitely were complicit, in my opinion, with the crimes that Epstein was perpetrating. Because if it wasn't for these banks and their fucking, lackadaisy attitude towards these transactions going through, Epstein probably wouldn't have been able to do most of the shit that he did. But it was a concerted effort of some of the most powerful organizations in the world to let this shit happen. Remember, if you do something wrong financially, the government and these banks will just clamp down on you. But if you've got enough money, I guess you can basically just pay to get away with it. And the thing is, these headlines do a very poor job of explaining how deep and filthy the rot gets. So again, I don't make these videos for no reason. Again, you should relay this information to other people. You should wake people up again that this happened. You know, people got away this blatantly. You know, I think that's the only way for people to wake up when they see how fucked up things really are when it comes to this entire investigation. It blows your mind, right? You think that it can happen, but then it does. Ladies and gentlemen, this is me, Mudahar, and if you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike it if you dislike it. I am out.